From 1969, Japan was prohibited or self-restricted to develop, own, and operate and use of space. The use of space has been modified in 1985 to allow the Japanese self-defense forces, the military forces, to use the commercial services, but not for the government satellites. The prohibition or self-restriction on the use of space for the military purposes and the change of the post-Cold War situation in East Asia in 1990s, especially the emergence of the North Korea as the bigger threat, especially with the missiles. We need to know what is happening in North Korea because the intelligence from United States is not reliable, and we don't have our own intelligence capabilities in North Korea. So satellite is probably the only way to gather the information about the activities in North Korea, and this IGS, the information gathering satellite, were created in order to make sure that we understand the activities in North Korea. We need to monitor what's going on in China and especially the relationship with Taiwan. And we are also monitoring what needs to be monitored in North Korea and Russia. So Japan is living in a very rough neighborhood, and we need to have its own intelligence capabilities. So we continue to do the R&D, but the most important objective of doing space is not to achieve the technological advancement, but to achieve for the commercial success, commercial competitiveness, and the security, improving the security situation in Japan. So since 2008, the Ministry of Defense is now investing much more bigger than before to build up the military capability for telecommunication, the surveillance and the reconnaissance capabilities, and also the commercialization. We are now helping a lot of startups, and there are a number of the competitive startup companies emerged from Japan. We need to set the rules of the road, but European Union has tried, United States has tried, and everyone tried but failed to have the set of the negotiated rules. So instead of setting up the negotiated rules or internationally agreed rules, we are planning to set the unilateral standards for the commercial activities. So Astroscale, which is the private companies to remove debris from space, is now the first company to do the active debris removal. The Japanese government needs to license the commercial activities. So in process of approving the license, we are setting up something called the guidance for the on-orbital activities. So on-orbital service guidelines is to set the rules to enforce the astroscale to be transparent about the information around the satellite. So the satellite needs to tell where they are, which object they are trying to achieve, and then what object they are going to take them down. Because if you are trying to take the space object out of the orbit, you can do this for taking out the other country's satellite out of the orbit. And that can be used for the space weapon. This is to give the more sort of set the model for the global audience that this is how you make your information transparent, and to make sure that to remove all the doubts about the potential use for the military purposes. We also set the new guideline called the Guideline for the Collision Avoidance. this collision avoidance guidelines were basically to set the another Japanese commercial companies to behave according to these guidelines if there is a collision, potential collision. So it will give much more predictability. All countries can follow the same process, and we provide the basic idea of how to regulate the national commercial activities. It seems that the current administration is not very keen on working together with others. United States is now doing their own business. They are launching the rockets just for the sake of the American success. So international cooperation without the United States needs to have more closer cooperation between Japan and the European Union, European Space Agency, to make sure that our forces combine together to achieve our own goals. Sometimes, we had a very ambitious idea of sending the astronauts to the moon, Japanese astronauts, European astronauts to the moon by using American technology and American launcher. This may not going to be the case anymore. So if we cannot launch our own astronauts to the moon, then what shall we do? Shall we give up the astronauts landing on the moon? Shall we focus on the robotics on the moon? What is our goals? We need to reshape our goals. Japan and Europe needs to start discussing about the world without the United States. China is perhaps the second largest space player after the United States. So if we want to achieve some sort of a moon landing and sending our astronauts to the moon, probably the cooperation with China is necessary. But there is always the flip side of a coin, which is the risks. The risks of working together with China, depending on China, may have the political implications. China may use that as the threat to the other political affairs, such as territorial disputes or any type of trade negotiation. They can say, "Oh, if you don't like my idea, then I'm not going to send your astronauts with my launcher." So, if you don't want that, then we cannot rely on China. And I think this may be the case. So, risk of depending on China is one of the major issues when we think of the relationship with China. But at the same time, there are something that we can offer to China. For example, the space data. We have more experience and capabilities of acquiring and analyzing the data. So there are some sort of a complementarity between Japan, Europe, and China. If we do more hardware joint development, I think there are more risks for technological transfer, the IP theft, things like that. But if we try to limit these technological transfer and try to cooperate on the scientific field or analyzing the global climate change, these kind of things may work together and benefit more. If you are working in, for example, the humanities or the philosophy or thoughts of space, I think still there are lots of elements that you can use your PhD studies into the actual policy making, because at the end of the day, the politicians and bureaucrats and policymakers are having their own policy understanding, and usually they are stick with the one policy idea. You need to change the way to think about space, how to use space, why we are doing space, why we need to go to space. I think these fundamental questions needs to be answered because the politicians and bureaucrats tend to think that this is what we used to. We need to give the reasons to think of spending such money into space activities.